Hi there, my name is Katherine Edwards, and I'm going to be presenting my research paper titled, Who's in Charge Here? How Feminist and Traditional Scholars Explain the Story of Jesus and the Canaanite Syrophoenician Woman. When the Bible was written, a woman's sphere of influence was restricted to her home and family. To go even further, Susan Isakun explains, it was shameful for a person to be out of place. A woman who had too public a role was unsuitably masculine. Thus, to emphasize their femininity, women were expected to be modest, shy, and quiet. Tertullian, who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, wrote that a female would rather see than be seen, illustrating the submissive role women were expected to take. Furthermore, Joseph ben Yohanan of Jerusalem, who lived around 150 BCE, stated, "He that talks much with womankind brings evil upon himself, and neglects the study of the law." Philo of Alexandria, 1st century CE, viewed women as inferior and subordinate because their minds were passive while men's minds were active. Thus, the idea that women should be seen and not heard was prevalent before and during Jesus' ministry. Stories involving Jesus healing women typically cast the females in silent and passive roles, because this was the status quo. However, the story of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman disrupts these patterns of submission and silence. Not only is she one of the only women in the Gospels who address Jesus, she also takes initiative and insists that Jesus heal her daughter. Antoinette Weyer calls stories like these in the Bible demand stories, because someone other than Jesus takes initiative, while Jesus takes a more passive role. Because the story of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman is a demand story, the interpretations of her passage in the Gospels have differed greatly among traditional and feminist scholarship. I argue that this is because traditional scholarship focuses on Jesus' actions and messianic identity, while feminist scholarship fixates on the woman's bold actions and motivations. In this story, which is found only in Mark and Matthew, the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus and begs him to cast a demon out of her daughter, but he refuses and insults her. However, she uses an insult to convince him to heal her daughter, which she ends up doing. This story is strange for many reasons. It is the only record of Jesus healing a female Gentile pagan, being bested in an argument, not physically confronting a demon, and refusing to heal someone. John Meyer notes, nowhere else in the gospel tradition does Jesus address a sincere petitioner with such harsh, insulting language. The Canaanite Syrophoenician woman shows the reader a side of Jesus that does not necessarily fit with his other portrayals, which has prompted many scholars to explain this abnormal behavior in different ways. Because this is the only example of Jesus refusing to heal someone in the Gospels, it is important to look at how and why he denies her daughter healing. In Matthew, Jesus denies the woman 3 times, through silence, theology, and omits of theology and insult. After the woman encounters Jesus and calls for help, he ignores her. Even his disciples want Jesus to send the woman away, but he answers them that he was sent only to Israel. In saying this, he actively ignores the woman, but also does not force her to leave. After this refusal, the woman still pleads with Jesus to help her. Jesus challenges her reply by saying, "It is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." By calling her a dog, he labels her with the term used to describe people who were hostile to God's people and laws. It was a very harsh term that compared people to dogs, who were, as Rindge phrases it, contemptible scavengers who lick human blood. However, the woman identifies with this term and seemingly changes Jesus' mind. I say seemingly because feminist scholars are more willing to hold that Jesus' mind was changed because they focus on his behavior throughout the story. while traditional scholars are more hesitant to express this change because they believe that Jesus' deity would imply that he is omniscient and therefore cannot change his mind. Immediately after her final plea, Jesus' demeanor changes. He addresses her directly to commend her faith and uses the vocative, "O woman," indicating that he's deeply moved by it. Francis Taylor Ginch writes, Jesus thus honors the woman and her faith, her unshakable confidence in him, and her insight into the inclusive power, presence, and mercy of God. Jesus' change in countenance at the woman's persistence and boldness is unique to the story of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman. The Canaanite Syrophoenician woman's persistence and faith, despite social constraints, are so extraordinary that Jesus seemingly changes his mind after refusing her 3 times. Joanna Dewey explains the woman's outlandish actions well. This is the only instance in the extant tradition of Jesus being taught by someone, and that someone is a woman who should not properly be speaking to him at all. It was extremely inappropriate for a woman to speak in public, especially with a man who was not her husband. Because her daughter needs his help, she breaks gender norms by pursuing Jesus and screaming at him in public. Gail O'Day summarizes her unseemly behavior by writing that the woman impinges on Jesus from all sides and does not hesitate to make her presence felt and demand known. Her refusal to leave after 3 denials also speaks to her faith that Jesus can and will heal her daughter if she persists. Although her behavior is entirely inappropriate, it is ultimately rewarded. Her quick reply that prompts Jesus to praise her faith and word has also produced conflicting interpretations about whether it was done in humility or because of her intelligence. Stuart Love argues that the woman's response was not a smart retort, but a plea for mercy. In her response, the woman acknowledges that she is not who Jesus came for, but she shows that the dogs, or Gentiles, can be fed with the byproduct of the Lord's table. His point illustrates how traditional scholarship seeks to emphasize Jesus' mercy and the woman's submissiveness. On the other side, Sharon Renge argues, her retort wins the day. Her point of view prevails and is eventually adopted by Jesus. Hers is the defining wisdom of the story. The irony and logic she used to recast Jesus' insult shows the woman's brilliant grasp of theology. Even in Renge's quote, she highlights the initiative in the woman's actions. Each sentence of her argument starts with the woman's actions. Jesus is merely the passive receiver. The contrast between these two scholars shows the tension and shift in focus of this story within biblical scholarship. One view highlights the woman's boldness in taking initiative and demanding healing, while the other casts her in a position of submissiveness and desperation. The most prevalent theory explains that Jesus was testing the woman's faith and his disciples' character with his silent behavior and theological responses. This theory finds its basis by focusing on what Jesus does not do, rather than what he does. Throughout Matthew and Mark, Jesus never directly sends the woman away. In Matthew, he remains silent in her cries until the disciples tell him to send her away. Although he has the power to dismiss her, he allows her to remain in his presence and question him, because her persistence further glorifies Jesus by illustrating his all-knowing power and pointing towards his kindness towards children later in the Gospels. Dorothy Lee argues that Jesus' actions strengthened the woman's faith rather than discouraging it, which may explain why she is the only person in Matthew who is described as having great faith. Ginch argues that the woman's great faith is contrasted with the disciples' lack of faith because of the location of the story in Matthew. In the preceding chapter, Jesus remarks on Peter's little faith because he sank after walking on water. In the chapter following the story of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman, Jesus is frustrated by the disciples' little faith because they do not understand his teaching. This interpretation is rooted in tradition because it explains Jesus' harsh language by pointing towards his identity as the Son of God. Jesus is seen as omniscient because he uses the testing of the woman's faith to teach the disciples. The woman is little more than a prop in the overall story. Another prominent interpretation of Jesus' actions is explained in the ethnic exclusivism theory. This theory focuses on Jesus' response that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Love observes that Jesus' behavior and words, including his healing activity and that of the 12, belong primarily to the public, political, Israelite social domain. Jewish nationalism was prevalent in this area because God had given them this land, but the Gentiles occupied it. Now, there are two explanations of why Jesus may have taken this mindset. One argues that Jesus was taking this mindset towards Gentiles in order to show its unfairness to his disciples. However, other scholars argue that the story conveys Jesus' humanity and realization that his former mindset was wrong. This branch considers that Jesus possibly faced deep inner turmoil over his identity as the Messiah because he was expected to overthrow and wipe out the Gentiles, but he was torn in this instance over the woman's plea. Because the woman uses what Lee calls covenant language and acknowledges that Israel is Jesus' first concern, Jesus heals her daughter and extends his mission. Wrench views her reshaping of Jesus' insult as a gift to Jesus because she opened his eyes and ministry to the Gentiles. This theory is prominent among feminist scholars because it elevates the woman's role in Jesus' ministry. She is viewed as the enlightened protagonist in this story who teaches the teacher. Rather than Jesus using her to prove a point, she uses him to gain healing for her daughter. Her bold, demanding demeanor is seen as a gift rather than inappropriate because the focus is on how the woman changes Jesus' mind. In contrast with how the ethnic exclusivism theory casts the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman as the protagonist, the socioeconomic theory portrays her as the villain. This theory rationalizes Jesus' behavior by proposing that the woman was, as Finch phrases it, an oppressor rather than one of the oppressed. In other words, the woman was of a high social class and wealthy, and she did not look out for the poor. So Jesus was challenging her privilege rather than attacking her race. This theory finds its basis in the geographical locations referenced in both Mark and Matthew, Tyre and Sidon. Residents of Tyre consisted of Jews and Gentiles, but there were economic, ethnic, religious, and cultural tensions between the two groups. In addition, Gentile residents of Tyre and Sidon were considered the most dangerous enemies of the Jews. The land they occupied was something that God had given the Jews, and the Gentiles continuously threatened to take it again. In addition, the Gentiles of Tyre were rich landowners who would exploit the Jews. They would rightly be called dogs. Especially when food was scarce, the landowners would abuse their Jewish workers who depended on them. Gerd Thacien summarized well. The economically stronger Tyrians probably often took bread out of the mouths of the Jewish rural population when they used their superior financial means to buy up the grain supply in the countryside. Besides the evidence of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman living in this area, Mark notes that the woman's child was healed in her bed. The word used for bed here could also be translated as couch and signifies the woman's possible upper-class position. Thus, the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman's geographical location and furniture allude to her possible upper-class status. Considering the socioeconomic tensions between the Tyrians and the Jews, it is possible that this story is about physical bread rather than spiritual bread. This woman's lifestyle may have been a source of suffering and starvation for her poor Jewish neighbors. Thacien again writes about the economically poor Jewish residents of Tyre. Certainly the message, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," found ready ears. Those are people who were indeed poor and longed for a revolution in their situation. In other words, the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman may have been a target for Jesus' preaching about the blessedness of the poor. Thus, the woman's request for bread, healing, may have been entirely inappropriate, considering that she may not have shared when others asked for her bread. However, she is faithful that Jesus is, as Sketch phrases it, rich in mercy and supplies bread of plenty for all. She understands the plight of the poor and throws herself upon Jesus' mercy, which prompts him to finally heal her daughter. Because of her understanding, the language in the story shifts from frugality to abundance. Finally, one must consider the possibility that her story could be a parallel about enjoying one's wealth on earth, like the interaction between the rich man and Lazarus, which only Luke includes, possibly in place of the story of the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman. In this interpretation, the focus shifts from Jesus' rude behavior to the woman's tainted past. She is not the hero. She is the repentant villain. This story supports the traditional portrayal of Jesus' grace and mercy because it exemplifies the woman's progression from a villain to a child of God. However, her persistence is still portrayed as in a positive light because it shows her true repentance from her past behavior. A lesser-known theory proposes that the woman was speaking in the form of a lament psalm. This theory is promising because it combines a feminist approach to the story while also emphasizing Jesus' messianic identity. Gail O'Day explains that in Israel's lament psalms, Israel demands that God should be God as God has promised to be. God made promises of life, not death, hope, not despair, wholeness, not brokenness. In other words, lament psalms provided a way for the Israelites to demand that God heal them, which resulted in healing and praise. According to O'Day, the woman's words parallel the model of this type of psalm. In particular, the woman's plea for mercy and use of Jesus' title are of similar form. Gitch remarks, the biblical presentation of this traditional prayer suggests that God welcomes this dialogue and that to argue with God in this manner is, in fact, an act of faith. Thus, by using this form, the woman acknowledges Jesus' messianic identity, which prompts him to heal her daughter and laud her faith. She trusts that Jesus will heal her daughter, so she perseveres and reminds him of his power. This theory provides a synthesis between traditional scholars and feminist scholars because it acknowledges Jesus' deity while exemplifying the woman's persistence and faith. Although all of these theories have different rationale for Jesus and the woman's actions, they all agree that this story is unusual because it is the only instance of Jesus refusing to heal someone and praising a person for their great faith. Because of her gender, the woman's actions are even more remarkable. She risks public shame with her reputation ruining actions. However, Jesus' actions towards her in the end show his respect for her faith and persistence. Depending on the interpretation, the woman's actions are covered up or praised. Traditional scholars typically focus on Jesus' actions since he is considered the protagonist of the Gospels, whereas feminist scholars tend to focus on the woman's actions since her perseverance and great faith serve as an example to everyone. Regardless of who scholars focus on in the story, it represents a turning point in Jesus' ministry. After his interaction with the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman, Jesus begins preaching and healing Gentiles. Although scholars do not know exactly what caused Jesus' uncharacteristic actions or the woman's great faith, the positive results of this interaction have had a profound impact on modern Christianity. Thank you, and I have my contact information on this slide. I love to speak with more people about my research. Thank you for listening.